All right, let's go ahead and get started today. We've made our way to the 20th century and getting closer to the contemporary period, although many of the things might still seem quite distant. Quite a bit of changes to Christianity in the 20th century, as we've seen throughout. And with politics, of course, there's a variety of things that we could look at, but there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. During the First World War, Russia experienced its own revolution as Marxist revolutionaries under the leadership of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov took over Russia. He was better known by his pen name Lenin, and so that's what most people know him by. He was a socialist who had been in some leadership positions before the revolution, but came to its head in 1917. The revolution would eventually overthrow the Tsar, the ruler of Russia, and his government, as well as withdraw from World War I. Eventually, several of the regions in the area would be brought together in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or sometimes referred to as the Soviet Union. In the midst of all this, the Russian Orthodox Church has a very difficult position. If you remember some of the things we talked about back in the 18th century, we talked about how the state in Russia had engaged in several activities to try and bring the Russian Orthodox Church further and further under state control. And so even into the late 19th and early 20th century, the Russian Orthodox Church was looking for greater freedoms, even prior to the revolution. But it did receive some freedoms under Lenin's government. But as the revolution kind of became firmly entrenched, became the institution, the church found itself subordinated to the state as well, especially because the state promoted a very militant atheism. Monasteries were closed. Later, many of them became forced labor camps, and pretty much all of them were closed by the Second World War. Churches were sometimes closed, sometimes destroyed. Clergy were arrested. And under the Soviet government, the church went underground, essentially, went into hiding. But it appears that the majority of people maintained their belief in God, their commitment to the Orthodox Church, despite this persecution. It just wasn't open. But by the beginning years of World War II, the Soviet leaders decided to ease some of the restrictions on the Orthodox Church in order to gain the allegiance of the people. Right? So it's kind of this nationalistic appeal, because as they're getting ready to enter into World War II, they need the support of their people, and so one of the ways they garner support is through easing some of these restrictions. A patriarch was allowed to be elected in 1943. This was the first time in 20 years that there had been a patriarch in Moscow. Which leads us into World War II. The unfortunate truth of World War II is that sometimes people who identify themselves as Christians supported Nazi and fascist regimes in Europe. Sometimes it was very public support. Many Christians applauded Hitler in those early years because Hitler outlawed pornography. He supported a variety of other moral laws, and so Christians looked at that aspect of Hitler and said, "Oh, this is great. He's trying to have a moral government." And because of that, sometimes Christians were silent when Hitler sent Jews and others to the death camps. Pope Pius XII, the Pope at the time, seems to have tried to exercise some moral authority in all of this by presenting himself as above the fray. But he also supported oppressive fascist regimes in Spain and in Italy, remained silent about Hitler's atrocities, largely because the papacy had a very precarious position in Europe at the time. German Protestant liberals often found themselves supportive of Hitler because the language he was using was similar to what they were saying: the perfectibility of the human race, the need to civilize the world. But there were other Christians who were quite outspoken about Nazism, and often they faced persecution, imprisonment, and sometimes death or exile. A good example of that is the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer grew up in Berlin, studied at the university there, becomes a Lutheran pastor, but he had traveled and was living in London at the time that the Nazis came to power. And as he saw Nazism spread, he became very concerned, returned to Germany, knowing it was dangerous for him. In the midst of all this, he writes perhaps his most famous work, The Cost of Discipleship. Largely, Bonhoeffer, in this book, is very critical of how the Reformed Church, the Protestant Church, has been separating faith and obedience. A lot of emphasis on faith, but not much emphasis on obedience. And so, largely, he looked at this as being what he called cheap grace. Here's a quote: "Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ." On the other hand was what he called costly grace. Again quoting, "Costly grace confronts us as a gracious call to follow Jesus. It comes as a word of forgiveness to the broken spirit and the contrite heart. It is costly because it compels a man to submit to the yoke of Christ and follow him. It is grace because Jesus says, 'My yoke is easy and my burden is light.' Costly grace is the gospel, which must be sought again and again and again. The gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it costs God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price. What has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God." Facing a lot of challenges and persecution, in 1939, Bonhoeffer headed to the United States to take up an academic position at Union Theological Seminary. Largely, this was due to pressure that he had received from the Gestapo. He stays for 4 weeks before he decides to return to Germany. He becomes entangled with a conspiracy to kill Hitler, even though, of course, he's talking about murder. But one of the things that Bonhoeffer claimed was this was something that was needed. Hitler needed to be stopped. He was arrested by the Gestapo in April of 1943 and continued to write. Eventually, these works were published as letters and papers from prison. He was hanged in 1945, along with thousands of others who had resisted Nazi policies. After the war, a variety of things happened that impacted Christianity. In the United States, there was a post-war boom in Christianity and Judaism as well. Large numbers of people flocked to churches. There was an increase in the number of church buildings constructed. There was an increase in people being involved in Bible study. And it was very possible to see frequently public intellectuals discussing religion, especially Christianity, in a variety of public formats, on television, on the radio, in the newspapers and magazines. But in other places, Christians were still facing persecution. After the Second World War, a variety of nations in Eastern Europe, and of course the nation of China, all became communist governments. In Europe, the Orthodox Church often faced similar challenges to the Russian Orthodox Church, the persecution and oppression, and a lot of the freedoms that the Russians had had pre and during the war, those began to disappear as well after World War II. Persecution often relaxed in moments where nationalistic patriotism was needed. So religion was allowed to be more public in these communist countries when it was more important to the nation. Something similar happened in China when the Communist Party came to power in the 1940s. Many religions and religious people found themselves facing persecution with the rise of Chinese communism. Confucius and Confucianism, for example, were revived, even though these were Chinese systems. They were looked upon as a tool of the aristocracy to oppress the lower classes. China's takeover of Tibet forced a lot of Tibetan Buddhists, including their leader, the Dalai Lama, to take refuge in India. Chinese concern about foreigners, the suspicion of anything from outside China, as well as the remembrance of Western imperialism, led to concerns that missionaries in China and Chinese converts were to be looked upon with suspicion, especially since the Vatican and the United States were very anti-communist. So any sort of missionary effort from any of those places was looked upon as trying to destabilize the Chinese government. Missionaries were either kicked out of China or imprisoned, and the government forced Chinese Christians to join officially sanctioned organizations while ostensibly allowing religious freedom. And so the idea here is that they claimed to be allowing people religious freedom, but you had to join specific groups. Catholics were expected to join the Catholic Patriotic Association. Protestants were expected to join the three self-patriotic movement. The three selves were self-government, self-support, and self-propagation. Apparently the idea was that if Chinese Christians were funneled into these organizations and then cut off from outside influence, right, connections with the United States, connections with the Vatican, that they would die off. These people in these groups were required to pledge their support to the government, to stand against imperialism, but actually kind of worked the opposite way. Christian leaders in China were re-educated, or they faced persecution. In the 1960s, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Chairman Mao Zedong, inaugurated a cultural revolution, which was meant to prevent a resurgence of capitalism that was apparently making its way through some of the Chinese leadership. Essentially, the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to purge anything that was against Chairman Mao's regime. All churches were closed, worship gatherings were prohibited, Bibles were burnt. The Three Self-Patriotic movement was also banned. Again, all of these were attempts to exact control, to bring about the elimination of Christianity, among other things. But essentially, the church went underground, went into hiding, and was developing in house churches, kind of like the very first centuries. And during this time, from the 60s through the contemporary period, these house churches experienced sizable growth. Public worship was permitted again in the late 70s, but there was still this expectation that you would register with the government, which meant that Christians would be under surveillance. And if you worshiped in a state church, you could be positive there was someone there that was spying on you for the government. And so public worship was allowed, but a lot of these unregistered house churches continued. Leaders who were discovered would be imprisoned or persecuted.